David Wells' book, No Place for Truth, Whatever Happened to Evangelical Theology, feels like a book that I've been looking for the past 5 years. As someone who's grown up in evangelicalism, spent most of my life in evangelical settings, and as someone who over the last 10 or so years has walked the long road of reform to historic Protestantism, this book was captivating for me, thought-provoking, and left me asking the question, can someone be both reformed and evangelical? This book, written in 1993, is David Wells analyzing the then culture of evangelicalism and asking the question, what has happened to evangelical theology? In this book, he's lamenting what he finds to be the current dismal state of evangelical theology, and he's asking, what led us to this place? How did we get here? And how can we ultimately fix the problem? He talks about an anti-intellectual and even anti-theological bias that makes its home in evangelical settings. And if you've been a reader of Part-Time Seminarian, you'll know that this concern is shared by Colin and I. So immediately this book grabbed me. Its approach was intriguing because I've found this to be the case for myself. As I've spent time in evangelical circles, different evangelical circles in different places, I've seen that this is in many ways a defining feature of evangelical settings. There is a attitude or disposition towards theology that is fundamentally negative, as if theology were the bad guy. And that's perplexing because in the church, we imagine that theology, that is words about God, I mean, the etymological root of the word theology, theos, logos, words about God, is the very thing that we traffic in the church, particularly as ministers. Our currency is talking about God. So it's perplexing in church settings when theology is treated as something that is bad, but nonetheless, I have experienced that to be the case in many evangelical settings. In explaining the problem, Wells says this: adjustments in doing theology, even large methodological adjustments, are not going to repair the damage that has been done, because the problem is less intellectual and more spiritual. It's this sort of analysis that drew me so powerfully to this book, because I think Wells is exactly right. He's saying that the problem with the anti-theological bias that makes its home in evangelicalism isn't an inability to traffic in theology, isn't a dearth of teachers willing to teach theology. No, it's actually a lack of interest in theology itself. The problem isn't cognitive, the problem isn't intellectual, the problem is spiritual. It's not so much a how-to problem as it is a hunger problem. It's not an ability issue, it's a willingness issue. Wells goes on to talk about how the modernization of our culture has produced certain cultural conditions that he calls modernity. And it's this modernity that has had a powerful shaping influence on evangelicalism and ultimately produced an environment where theology is no longer welcome. In modernized society, Wells argues, meaning is not found in external objective truth, but rather in internal subjective personal experiences, and therefore environments that have been shaped by modernity, environments where modernity is embraced, theology is necessarily displaced. And that's what Wells argues is the problem for contemporary evangelicalism. It has been so shaped by modernity that it has been forced to jettison its theological core and replace it with something else. And what is that something else, you might ask? Well, Wells suggests that it is the insights of the psychologist and the business professional. In fact, let me read you a quote from Wells. He says, "As the therapeutic age supplants confession and its preaching is psychologized, the meaning of the Christian faith becomes privatized. At a single stroke, confession is eviscerated and reflection is reduced mainly to thought about oneself. That being the case, the responsibility of seeking to be a Christian in the modern world is then transformed into a search for what Farley calls a technology of practice, for techniques with which to expand the church and to understand the self that borrow mainly from business management and psychology. Thus, The pastor seeks to embody what modernity admires and redefines what pastoral ministry now means in light of this culture's most admired types, the manager and the psychologist. I find that analysis to be bone-chilling and devastatingly accurate. In evangelical settings that have embraced modernity, the impulses of the therapist and of the entrepreneurial business mogul are the things that rule the day because they rule the day in our modernized society. Now, the next thing that Wells says is what I find to be most interesting, and it's the catalyst for this video. Yet before we proceed further, it is important that we understand the novelty of the situation. In eviscerating theology in this way, by substituting for its defining confessional core elements a new set of principles, evangelicals are close to the point where they will no longer be able to speak of themselves as historic Protestants. Now, this book was written in 1993, and here we are in 2026, and I'm left asking the question, have we come to that point where evangelicals can no longer speak of themselves as historic Protestants? Have the things that define evangelicalism drifted so far from those things that define historic Protestantism that we really cannot speak of both of them being of the same substance? Can you be both Reformed and evangelical? And of course, the answer to that question depends on how you define both of those terms. As it pertains to the latter, people attach all kinds of different ideas to what it means to be Reformed. When people have asked me in the past what it means to be Reformed, I've typically answered from a doctrinal perspective, describing the 3 C's of Reformed theology, that is Calvinism, confessionalism, and covenantalism. But recently, I've actually found it more helpful to talk about Reformed theology simply as that theology that flows out of the Protestant Reformation. To be Reformed is to be attached to that body of doctrine that comes to us in the Reformation, and therefore to be Reformed, in my view, is simply to be a historic Protestant. You are aligning yourself with that theology, that set of confessional statements that comes to us in the Protestant Reformation. And see, that is the key word. The key word that defines historic Protestantism is confession. Reformed theology is essentially confessional. And by the word confessional, I mean both finding its orientation according to the historic confessions of the faith that we have coming out of the Protestant Reformation, but then even at a more basic level, Reformed theology is confessional in that it confesses a set of doctrines that are essential to its identity. So here's the rub. Can you be a Reformed evangelical if what is essential to being Reformed is being confessional, but what is the hallmark or calling card of broad evangelicalism is being anti-confessional? Now notice, I didn't say that anti-confessionalism is essential to evangelicalism. I don't think there's necessarily anything in evangelicalism that requires you to be anti-confessional, but I do think that evangelicalism has become so deeply pervaded with an anti-confessional bias that it's almost ubiquitous within the tradition. Now, of course, just like the word Reformed, there are all kinds of ways to talk about the word evangelical. There's an old historic way of talking about evangelicalism, the evangelicalism of the Puritans, say, or of Jonathan Edwards. There's another way of talking about evangelicalism that approaches it doctrinally. Ebbington's quadrilateral is another way of thinking about evangelicalism. He describes evangelicals as conversionistic, activistic, biblicist, and crucifistic. Maybe if you're thinking about evangelicalism one of those ways, then sure, you might be able to be a Reformed evangelical. But when I'm speaking about evangelicalism, I'm thinking about it in the way that I think most people think about evangelicalism. Those things that have become associated with the word evangelicalism, I think, are the things that Wells highlights in his book. It's interesting because at the end of the book, when he talks about reforming evangelicalism, Wells introduces this term, historic evangelicalism. He hasn't used that term elsewhere in the book, and I think he does that because he wants to section off that evangelicalism that is antithetical with historic Protestantism over against an evangelicalism that might not be. But anyways, I'm making this video because these ideas were arresting to me, and wrestling through them has proven to be fruitful. I thought they might be to you as well. I'm not quite ready to abandon the title evangelical, but I do think as evangelicals, we need to think carefully about how we identify ourselves as Christians for the sake of clarity and for the sake of witness. So if you've made it this far, I thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this kind of content, let us know. We'd love to make more video content at Part-Time Seminarian. You can join this conversation by subscribing to our Substack, by commenting down below, subscribing to the YouTube page. All these things help support us and let us know that you're interested in more of this kind of content. So I hope this has been a blessing to you, and we'll see you next time.